Shadow Trail Files is back again. Tonight's submission comes from deep inside the Appalachian wilderness, where the trails don't just end, they disappear. These are not stories made for entertainment. These are real accounts sent by people who swear they survived something they still can't explain. If you're listening alone, you might want to keep some light on, because once the forest is described in detail, it starts to feel like it's around you. Before we begin, make sure you are subscribed. Most people don't come back after their first story here. Some say it's coincidence. Others say it's something else entirely. Tonight's file was sent by someone who walked into the woods and came out different. If he came out at all. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The first thing I found was my own boot print. And the second thing I found was the same boot print walking toward me from the opposite direction. I was 3 miles inside a restricted section of the Appalachian backcountry when I noticed it in the mud, perfectly preserved beneath the dripping branches, the tread pattern identical to the boots on my feet. I stopped so suddenly that my radio swung against my chest. For a few seconds I convinced myself it was an old impression from earlier that morning, distorted by the rain, until I looked down at my boots and realized the mud on them was completely different. Fresh red clay from the maintenance road, while the print in front of me was black mountain soil. I was working as a seasonal park ranger in the southern Appalachians, and by then I had spent enough nights alone in those woods to understand that fear usually comes from things you can't explain, not things you can see. But this was different. I crouched beside the print and measured it with my hand. Size 11. My size. Same heel wear. Same missing chunk along the outer edge where the rubber had torn away 2 weeks earlier. There were 12 prints leading deeper into the forest, all heading toward me. And then they simply stopped. No return trail. No footprints turning left or right. Nothing. Just 12 impressions in wet soil, ending in the middle of the trail. I radioed dispatch and told them I had found something strange, but before I could explain, my radio crackled and a voice whispered my name. Not my call sign, my actual name. Evan? I froze. Dispatch had not responded. The voice came again, quieter this time. Evan, don't follow the prints. I looked toward the trees. Nothing moved. The rain had stopped, but the forest was still dripping around me, each drop hitting leaves with a slow, irregular rhythm. I pressed the transmit button. Dispatch, did you just call me? Static. Then the same voice answered. No. I felt the cold move through my chest. I asked dispatch if anyone else was operating on my frequency. They said no. Then they told me something that made me turn around and look back toward the trailhead. My GPS had been transmitting my location for the last 47 minutes, but according to their system, I hadn't moved more than 30 yards from the trailhead. I was standing nearly 3 miles inside the restricted zone. I checked my GPS. It showed a blue dot exactly where I stood. Then the screen blinked. The blue dot moved backward along the trail by itself. 10 yards. 20. 50. Then it stopped at the exact location where I had parked my truck. I called dispatch again, but this time nobody answered. I started walking back. I didn't run because running in those mountains at night is how people break ankles and disappear. I kept my flashlight low and followed the trail, trying not to look into the woods. About 5 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow. Heavy. Crunching wet leaves. I stopped. They stopped. I took 1 step. They took 1 step. I turned around quickly, shining my light down the trail. Nothing. Then I noticed something lying between 2 trees about 30 feet away. It was a ranger hat. My ranger hat. The exact same model I was wearing. I reached up and touched my head. My hat was still there, I walked closer and saw the name patch sewn across the front. Evan Mercer. My name. The hat was soaked, covered in black mud, and there was something dark dried inside the brim that looked disturbingly like blood. I didn't touch it. I backed away and radioed dispatch again. This time a different voice answered. An older man's voice. Calm. Almost bored. You found it. I asked who he was. He said, You already know. I told him I was a park ranger and demanded his identification. He laughed softly. No, you're not. Then the radio went dead. I stood there for nearly a minute, listening to the forest. That's when I heard something above me. A branch creaked. I slowly looked up. There was a man standing between the trees on the slope, maybe 60 feet away. He was wearing a ranger uniform. My uniform. Same green shirt. Same dark pants. Same shoulder patch. Same hat. He was facing away from me. I called out, Ranger! He didn't move. I called again. He slowly turned his head. I couldn't see his face because the hood of his jacket covered it, but I could see his hands. They were hanging at his sides, completely motionless. Then he raised one finger and pointed behind me. I didn't turn around. I already knew what he wanted me to see. I heard footsteps approaching from the trail ahead. One pair, then another, then another. Within seconds, the darkness behind me sounded like a dozen people walking through wet leaves. I looked back anyway. Nothing. But the footsteps kept coming. The ranger on the hill suddenly began walking toward me. I stepped backward. He stepped forward. I raised my flashlight and finally caught his face. It was mine. Same eyes. Same scar above my eyebrow. Same beard. But his skin was grey and swollen, and his mouth was stretched into a smile so wide that I could see every tooth. He whispered something I couldn't hear. Then my radio came alive. My own voice came through the speaker. Evan, don't let him reach the trailhead. I stared at the thing wearing my face. It smiled wider. Then it said, in my exact voice, Too late. Behind me, somewhere in the darkness, my truck horn suddenly started blaring. I ran. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember sprinting through the trees, slipping in mud, branches tearing at my jacket while the footsteps chased me from every direction. My radio kept transmitting my breathing, even though I wasn't touching it. Then I heard my own voice screaming through the speaker, begging me to stop. I didn't stop. I reached the trailhead just before dawn and found my truck exactly where I had left it. The driver's door was open. The engine was running. The interior lights were on. I climbed inside and locked the doors. There was mud all over the driver's seat, and on the steering wheel, someone had written 4 words with a wet finger. You came back too soon. I drove straight to the ranger station and didn't tell anyone what I had seen. I couldn't. Not until 3 days later, when the park supervisor called me into his office and placed a plastic evidence bag on the desk. Inside was my ranger hat. The same hat I had found in the woods. I stared at it and told him I had never touched it. He looked confused. Then he said, We found this in your truck. I told him that was impossible because I had thrown the hat I found in the forest into the woods before I left. He slowly shook his head. Evan, this wasn't found in the forest. He turned the evidence bag around. There was something written inside the brim. 3 words. Same handwriting as the message on my steering wheel. We found you first. I quit the next morning. But 6 months later, I received a voicemail from the park office. The recording was only 8 seconds long. It was my own voice, whispering through heavy static. Evan, I'm still on the trail. Then, behind my voice, I heard something that made me delete the recording immediately. A second voice whispered my name, and that voice was laughing. 6 months after I quit the Park Service, I convinced myself the voicemail had been a coincidence, a prank, or maybe some sick joke played by someone who knew about the incident. But then, at 2:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, my old Ranger radio turned on by itself. I had kept it inside a cardboard box in the back of my closet, batteries removed because I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. And when I heard the familiar burst of static coming from the closet, I sat upright in bed and stared at the darkness. The radio crackled again. Then my own voice whispered through the speaker, "Evan, you shouldn't have left." I didn't touch it. I didn't breathe. Then came 3 slow knocks from somewhere inside my house. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, checking the hallway, the kitchen, the windows, everything. Nothing. Then the radio spoke again. "He's outside." I looked toward the front window. There was a shape standing beneath the streetlight across the road, a man in a ranger uniform. My stomach dropped. I called the police, but while I was explaining what I could see, the figure disappeared. The officer who arrived 20 minutes later found nothing outside, but before leaving, he asked me a strange question. "Did you ever work with a ranger named Daniel Voss?" I told him no. He stared at me for several seconds and said, "That's strange, because your old supervisor gave us that name when he reported you missing." I laughed because I thought he was mistaken. I had never been reported missing. I was standing in my own house. I showed him my identification. He looked at it, then at me, and his expression changed. "Sir, what year do you think it is?" I told him 2026. He slowly pulled out his phone and showed me the date. It was 2026. Then he opened an old missing person report. The photograph attached to it was me. Same face, same scar, same name. The report said, "Evan Mercer, park ranger, missing from the Appalachian backcountry 6 months earlier. Last known location, restricted trail section." I told him the report was impossible because I had been living in this house for 6 months. He asked me to step outside. I refused. Then my old Ranger radio suddenly crackled again from the closet. The officer heard it. His hand immediately went to his weapon. My voice came through the speaker. "Don't let him take you back." The officer looked at me. "Who is that?" I whispered. "Me." Then the radio said something neither of us expected. "No, not you." The voice changed. It became the older man's voice from the mountain. "That's the one who came back." The officer stepped backward. I heard him whisper, "Oh God." Then every light in my house went out at once. The radio clicked off. For several seconds there was absolute silence. Then we heard footsteps walking slowly across my ceiling. One step. Pause. Another step. The officer pointed his flashlight upward. Nothing was there. The footsteps stopped directly above us. Then something dragged itself across the ceiling, slowly, heavily, like a body being pulled by its arms. We ran outside. The officer called for backup while I stood in the driveway, staring at my dark house. That's when I noticed my front door was open. I was certain I had locked it. We entered together. Nothing had been disturbed except the closet. The cardboard box containing my ranger equipment had been opened. My old uniform was lying on the floor. And sitting on top of it was a folded map of the Appalachian Trail. Someone had circled one location in red ink. The exact place where I had found the impossible boot prints. Underneath the circle were 4 words. "He's waiting for you." The officer refused to let me go alone, so we drove toward the park before sunrise. I didn't want to go, But something inside me already knew I would eventually return. When we reached the ranger station, every radio inside the building was turned on. All of them were broadcasting the same sound. Footsteps. Hundreds of them. The supervisor was nowhere to be found. On his desk was a handwritten note. It said, "If Mercer returns, do not tell him what happened." The officer looked at me. "What happened?" I didn't answer. We found the supervisor's vehicle near the restricted trail. The driver's door was open. His body was not inside. There were muddy footprints around the vehicle, but the footprints were strange. Some were human, some were much longer, and some looked like they belonged to bare feet with 6 toes. We followed them until the trail disappeared beneath thick fog. Then I heard my name. "Evan!" I turned. The officer was standing beside me. His face was pale. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, my ranger radio crackled. "Evan, come home." The voice was mine. Then another voice whispered, "He doesn't know yet." We kept walking. The fog became so thick that we could barely see 10 feet ahead. Eventually, we reached the clearing where I had seen the thing wearing my face. The ranger hat was still there, except now there were dozens of them hanging from the trees. Every hat had my name on it. Some were old and torn. Some looked brand new. One was still dripping wet. The officer began backing away. "How many people have been here?" he whispered. I counted the hats. 37. Then I noticed something written beneath them on the trunk of a massive oak tree. Names, ranger names, dates. Some were decades old. The last name was mine. But beneath my name was another line, a date that hadn't happened yet. The officer saw it too. "Evan," he whispered, "that's tomorrow." Something moved behind the tree. We raised our flashlights. A man stepped into the clearing wearing my uniform. It was me, again. But this time his face wasn't smiling. He looked terrified. He raised both hands and shouted, "Don't listen to him!" I looked at the officer. "Which one?" The other me pointed behind us. "The one standing next to you." I slowly turned toward the officer. He was staring at me with a strange expression. Then he smiled. His teeth were too long. His eyes were completely black. The thing wearing the officer's face whispered, "You were never supposed to leave." I ran toward the other ranger, toward myself. But the fog swallowed everything. I heard the officer screaming behind me, then my own voice screaming with him. I kept running until I reached the trailhead. My truck was waiting there with the engine running. I opened the door and climbed inside. On the passenger seat was a folded piece of paper. I opened it with shaking hands. It contained only one sentence. "You finally made it back." I looked into the rearview mirror. The back seat was empty. Then I saw something reflected in the mirror that wasn't inside the truck. Behind me, standing on the trail, were 37 park rangers. Every one of them was wearing my face. And at the very back stood the oldest one, the man from the radio. He raised his hand and pointed toward the passenger seat. I slowly looked down. There was another note beneath my hand. This one was written in fresh blood. "Tomorrow is your first day." I never drove away. The truck was found 3 days later, abandoned at the trailhead. The engine was still running. My body was never recovered. But the ranger station received one final transmission at exactly 2:17 that morning. It lasted 11 seconds. First came static. Then my voice whispered, "Please don't send anyone looking for me." A second voice answered from somewhere deep in the forest. "We already did." Then a third voice, one nobody at the station recognized, whispered the words that ended the transmission. "Now, there are 38. Story 2. At 4:36 in the morning, the ranger station received a 911 call from a trail that had been closed for 11 years. And the strangest part wasn't the call itself. It was the fact that the caller was using the voice of a man who had been dead for 19 years. I was the night duty park ranger that week, alone at a remote Appalachian station surrounded by miles of forest. And when the dispatcher patched the call through, I heard breathing first, slow breathing, close to the microphone. Then a man's voice whispered, "Please send a ranger." "I'm lost." I asked for his location. There was a long silence. Then he said, "I'm standing where the trail ends." I checked the coordinates the dispatcher sent me and felt my stomach tighten. The location was deep inside an abandoned section of the park known locally as Black Hollow, a trail that had been permanently closed after a ranger disappeared there in 2007. Nobody was supposed to enter it. The bridges had been removed, warning signs installed, and the trail was marked on every official map as inaccessible. I asked the dispatcher to keep the caller talking while I prepared my gear. The voice suddenly whispered, "He's coming back." I asked who was coming. The caller didn't answer. Instead, I heard something in the background. 3 slow knocks. Then the man said, "Please hurry. He doesn't like the light." The call ended. I contacted my supervisor, but he didn't answer. I grabbed my flashlight, medical kit, radio, and sidearm, and drove toward Black Hollow. The farther I went, the worse the weather became. Rain covered the windshield, fog filled the road, and by the time I reached the old trail gate, I could barely see 20 feet ahead. I parked and walked through the broken barrier. The first thing I noticed was that the warning sign had been scratched apart. Someone had carved a sentence across it. "He still works here." I radioed dispatch and told them I was entering. Static answered. I continued down the trail. About 20 minutes later, I found the first footprint. Barefoot. Deep in the mud. I found another 10 yards later. Then another. They were enormous. Almost 13 inches long, but what bothered me most was their direction. They weren't coming from the trail. They were coming out of the forest and crossing it. I followed them until they disappeared beside an old fire tower. The tower had been abandoned for decades, but a dim yellow light was glowing inside the cabin at the top. I stared at it for several seconds because there was no electricity running to that tower. I called out, "Park ranger!" Something moved behind the window. I climbed the stairs. Each step groaned beneath my weight. Halfway up, I heard someone climbing behind me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around and shined my flashlight downward. Nothing. I continued upward. Again, footsteps followed. This time, they were faster. I reached the top and pushed open the cabin door. There was a desk, an old radio, a rusted chair, and a man sitting with his back toward me. He was wearing an old ranger uniform. "Sir," I said. He didn't move. I stepped closer. "Are you injured?" His head slowly turned. His face was pale and covered in deep wrinkles. I recognized him immediately from an old photograph in the ranger archives. Ranger Thomas Bell, the man who disappeared in 2007, the dead ranger from the 911 call. He looked at me and whispered, "You're late." I couldn't move. He pointed toward the radio on the desk. It was transmitting the same 911 call I had heard at the station. My own voice came through the speaker. "Please send a ranger. I'm lost." I stared at him. He smiled. "That's you." I told him that was impossible. He leaned closer and whispered, "Not yet." Then the lights inside the tower went out. Something slammed against the cabin door. Once. Twice. Then again, harder. The old ranger didn't react. He simply looked at me and said, "Whatever you hear, don't open that door." Something outside began scratching the wood, slowly, patiently. Then a voice spoke from the other side. My voice. "Ranger, open the door." I stepped backward. Thomas Bell grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His fingers were freezing cold. "It learned your voice," he whispered. The thing outside knocked 3 times. Then it said my name. Then it began crying like a child. Then it started laughing. Thomas looked terrified for the first time. He whispered, "It knows you're here now." The door handle slowly began turning. I raised my flashlight and sidearm. Thomas shook his head. "Don't shoot it." I asked why. He looked directly into my eyes and said, "Because the last ranger who shot it became the thing standing outside." The handle stopped. Silence returned. Then something began walking around the tower. Slow footsteps circling the cabin. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a 4th set of footsteps joined them. Then a 5th. Thomas closed his eyes. "They're waiting." I asked him how many there were. He whispered, "Everyone who answered the call." Suddenly, the radio came alive. The dispatcher from my station was screaming my name. "Ranger Cole! Get out! Get out now!" I reached for the radio. Thomas slapped my hand away. "That's not dispatch." The voice screamed again, but this time it sounded exactly like my supervisor. "Cole, open the door." Then another voice joined it. My mother's voice. Then my brother's. Then voices of people I hadn't heard in years, all of them calling my name from outside the cabin. Thomas started crying silently. It always does that. I asked him what it wanted. He looked toward the floor and whispered, "A replacement." The scratching stopped. The tower became completely silent. Then Thomas slowly stood and walked toward the door. I grabbed his arm. "What are you doing?" He turned toward me with tears running down his face. "I'm sorry." Before I could stop him, he opened the door. There was nothing outside. No creature, no footsteps, no fog. Just darkness. Thomas stepped onto the platform. Then something pulled him backwards so violently that his body disappeared into the trees without making a sound. I slammed the door shut and locked it. The radio immediately crackled. Thomas's voice whispered through the speaker, "Don't come looking for me." I stared at the radio. Then my own voice answered him. "I already am." I looked down at my hands. Mud was covering my fingers. I had no memory of touching the ground. Then I noticed something written across my palm in black dirt. 3 words. "The trail is open." Behind me, the cabin door slowly unlocked itself, and from the darkness outside came the sound of dozens of bare feet stepping onto the wooden stairs. I didn't wait to see what came up those stairs. I grabbed the radio, kicked open the rear window of the fire tower cabin, and climbed onto the outside platform just as the first footsteps reached the door. The rain had stopped completely, but the fog below was moving like water, rolling between the trees in thick white waves. I climbed down the emergency ladder as fast as I could, hearing the cabin door slam open above me. Something screamed my name from the tower. I refused to look up. Halfway down, I heard another voice whisper directly beside my ear, "Cole." I nearly fell. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. I continued climbing until my boots hit the ground, then ran toward the trail. My radio suddenly crackled. "Ranger Cole, stop." It was dispatch. I pressed the button. "Confirm your location." Static. Then the dispatcher answered, "You're not in Black Hollow." I stopped running. "What?" She repeated herself. "You're not in Black Hollow." I told her I was standing directly beside the fire tower. She went silent for several seconds. Then she said, "Cole, Black Hollow was removed from the park maps in 2008. I told her I knew that. She whispered, "No, you don't understand. The entire mountain was closed after the disappearance. There is no active trail there. There hasn't been one for 18 years. I looked back toward the tower. It was gone. There was nothing between the trees except darkness. No stairs. No cabin. No tower. I stood there staring at an empty patch of forest where a 100-year-old structure had been standing less than a minute earlier. Then my radio spoke again. This time it was Thomas Bell. "Don't trust the radio." I immediately switched it off. The trail ahead was barely visible through the fog, but I started walking anyway. After 20 minutes, I found a wooden sign nailed to a tree. Black Hollow. 3 miles. I stared at it. I had just come from there. I turned around. The trail behind me was gone. Trees stood where the path had been. No footprints. No mud. Nothing. I began walking toward the sign because there was nowhere else to go. About a mile later, I found an abandoned campsite. There was a cold fire pit, a torn sleeping bag, and a metal ranger box sitting beneath a tree. The box had my name engraved on it. Cole Mercer, property of National Park Service. I opened it. Inside was an old notebook. The first page contained a handwritten report dated October 14th, 2007. It was written by Thomas Bell. I read it under my flashlight. He described hearing a 911 call from an abandoned trail. He entered Black Hollow alone. He found a fire tower that shouldn't have been there. He met something wearing the face of another ranger. He tried to escape. Then the report ended abruptly. The final sentence said, "If anyone finds this notebook, do not answer when it calls your name." I turned the page. The next report was dated 2008, then 2009, then 2010. Every report described the same incident, but each one was written by a different ranger. Some names I recognized from old park records. Some had disappeared from the system completely. Every report ended with the same warning. Don't answer when it calls your name. The final report was dated 2026. Today's date. The author's name was mine. I dropped the notebook. The radio in my pocket suddenly switched itself on. My own voice whispered, "Cole, where are you?" I didn't answer. "Cole." Silence. Then, very softly, "I can see you." I looked around. Nothing. I picked up the notebook and started running. The fog thickened until the trees became shadows. Then I saw lights ahead. A ranger station. Relief hit me so hard that I almost cried. I ran toward it and pushed open the door. 2 park rangers were sitting inside. One was drinking coffee. The other was filling out paperwork. They looked at me and smiled. "You made it back." I asked where we were. Neither answered. I looked at the wall. A calendar was hanging there. October 14th, 2007. I felt my stomach drop. The younger ranger stood up. "You look confused." I asked what year it was. He smiled. "You know what year it is." I backed toward the door. The older ranger reached beneath the desk and pulled out an old photograph. He placed it in front of me. It showed 5 rangers standing beside the Black Hollow fire tower. Thomas Bell was in the center. I recognized 2 other faces from the old reports. Then I saw myself standing at the far end of the photograph. Same uniform, same face, same scar. But I looked much younger. I whispered, "That's impossible." The older ranger shook his head. "You were always here." I ran outside. The forest had changed. The trees were smaller. The trail was freshly maintained. There were no warning signs, no barriers, no abandoned structures. I stumbled down the path until I reached a ranger vehicle. Someone was sitting inside. I opened the passenger door. It was Thomas Bell. He looked exactly as he had when I first saw him in the tower. He turned toward me and said, "You finally remember." I asked him what was happening. He pointed toward the rearview mirror. In the reflection, I saw myself standing behind the vehicle. But the real me was sitting beside him. The reflection smiled. Thomas whispered, "That's what takes your place." I looked away. When I looked back, the reflection was gone. Thomas started the engine. "We have to get you out before it learns everything about you." We drove through the forest for what felt like hours. Eventually, we reached the trailhead. I jumped out and ran toward the road. A modern Ranger truck was parked there. The date on the dashboard display read August 8th, 2026. I had returned to my own time. I ran toward the vehicle and found a young ranger sitting inside. I told him to call for help. He looked at me strangely. Then his radio crackled. "Ranger Cole, report." I grabbed the radio. "I'm here." Silence. Then dispatch answered. "Cole, where have you been?" I looked at the young ranger. He was staring at me with terror. "We've been looking for you for 6 months." I couldn't speak. Then he pointed toward the forest behind me. Someone was standing between the trees. Thomas Bell. He raised his hand. Behind him stood dozens of rangers, all wearing uniforms from different decades, all staring at me. Then the young ranger whispered, "Who's that?" I turned back toward the forest. Thomas was gone. Every ranger was gone. Only one person remained. Me. Another version of me stood at the tree line, wearing my uniform. He smiled and slowly raised his radio. My radio answered from my own hand. "Cole," he whispered, "you forgot something." I looked down. The black dirt was still covering my palm. The words had changed. They no longer said, "The trail is open." Now they said, "The trail is you." The other me stepped backward into the trees. I raised my weapon and followed him. I don't remember doing it. I don't remember entering the forest. The last thing I remember clearly is hearing the young ranger screaming behind me, "Don't follow him!" Then the woods went silent. 3 days later, the Park Service found my truck abandoned beside Black Hollow. My radio was still transmitting. They listened to the recording later. For 27 minutes, there was nothing but footsteps. Then my voice came through. "Please send a ranger." A dispatcher answered, "Cole, we're sending someone now." My voice whispered, "Don't." The dispatcher asked why. And after a long silence, another voice answered from somewhere behind the microphone. "Because I'm already the ranger." The recording ended there. But according to the official report, the radio continued transmitting for another 6 hours after everyone had left the station. Every few minutes, a different ranger's voice came through. Thomas Bell, Daniel Voss. Names belonging to people who disappeared decades ago. And finally, at 4:36 in the morning, my voice returned one last time. It whispered, "Please send a ranger. I'm lost." Then another voice answered. It was the dispatcher who had received the original call. She said, "Where are you?" My voice replied, "Standing where the trail ends." Then something whispered directly into the microphone, "We're waiting for the next one." Story 3. I found the missing hiker sitting perfectly still beside a trail that had been searched 12 times. And when I called his name, he raised one finger to his lips and pointed at the man standing 30 yards behind me. I was a backcountry ranger in the Appalachian Mountains, and the hiker had been missing for 4 days. His name was Caleb Rains, 29 years old, experienced outdoorsman, no known medical conditions, no reason to disappear. Search teams had covered every trail within a 5-mile radius. Dogs had tracked his scent to a creek and then lost it. A helicopter had flown over the area twice. We had found his backpack, one boot, and a phone with a cracked screen, but no Caleb. Then, on the 5th morning, I was checking an old service trail when I saw him. He was sitting on a fallen tree, less than 20 feet from the path. His clothes were clean. His boots were tied. His backpack was beside him. He looked exactly like the photograph his family had given us. I shouted, "Caleb!" He slowly turned his head. His eyes were wide and completely exhausted. I started toward him, but he immediately raised one finger to his lips. Then he pointed behind me. I turned around. A man was standing between two trees about 30 yards away. He wore dark clothing and a grey backpack. I called out, "Sir, this area is closed." The man didn't answer. I reached for my radio. The stranger slowly raised his hand and waved. Caleb grabbed my sleeve so hard that his fingers dug into my arm. He whispered, "Don't let him see your face." I looked back at the man. He was still standing there. Then I realized something wrong. He wasn't wearing shoes. His bare feet were covered in mud, but there were no footprints beneath him. I told Caleb to stay where he was while I contacted the search team. My radio produced nothing but static. I tried again. Static. Then a voice came through. "Ranger Hale, do not approach the missing subject," I answered. "Who is this?" The voice said. "He's not Caleb." I looked at the man sitting beside me. Caleb stared at the ground. I asked him what happened. He whispered. "I went looking for the person who was calling my name." I asked who had called him. He said, "Me." I thought he meant he had called himself, but then he explained what happened on the first night. He had been camping near the ridge when he heard someone walking around his tent. The person outside whispered his name. Caleb opened the tent and saw himself standing among the trees. Same clothes. Same backpack. Same face. The copy told him, "Don't follow me." Caleb followed anyway. He said the copy led him deeper into the woods until they reached a cabin that wasn't on any map. Inside were photographs covering the walls. Hundreds of them. Pictures of hikers, hunters, rangers, families, children. Every photograph showed the person standing somewhere in the Appalachian forest. Some pictures were decades old. Caleb said he found one photograph of himself. It had been taken 3 days before he disappeared. He was standing in the exact clearing where we were sitting, but the picture showed him from behind. And beside him was another figure. I asked him what happened next. Caleb looked at me and whispered, "I saw you." I felt a cold sensation move across my neck. "You weren't wearing a ranger uniform," he said. "You were standing beside me in the picture." I told him that was impossible because I had never met him before. He shook his head. "Not you. The other you." Behind us, a branch snapped. We both turned. The stranger was gone. I immediately pulled Caleb to his feet. We needed to leave. But Caleb refused to move. He pointed toward the trail. "That's where he wants us to go." I asked him why. Caleb said, "Because that's where the others are." We started walking in the opposite direction, away from the trail. Within minutes, we found something hanging from a tree. A ranger jacket. My jacket. I looked down. I was still wearing mine. The jacket hanging from the branch was identical, including the name Patch. Hale. I reached toward it, then stopped. Something was written beneath my name in black marker. "Don't turn around." Caleb whispered, "Whatever you do, don't." I felt breathing against the back of my neck. Slow, warm, human. I stood completely still. Caleb closed his eyes. The breathing stopped. Then a voice whispered directly behind me. My voice. "Caleb, run!" Caleb immediately sprinted into the woods. I turned despite the warning. Nothing was there. I chased after him. We ran downhill until we reached an old wooden bridge over a narrow ravine. Caleb stopped suddenly. He stared across the bridge. There were people standing on the other side. 6 of them. A woman, 2 men, an elderly couple, a teenage boy. All of them looked exhausted. All of them were staring at us. I recognized the woman from a missing person poster at the ranger station. She had disappeared 7 years earlier. I recognized the teenage boy too. He had been missing for 11 months. They were all alive. I shouted, "Stay where you are!" The woman shook her head. "Don't cross." I asked why. She pointed toward the bridge. "He's underneath it." Then I heard something moving below us. Slow scratching against the wooden supports. Caleb grabbed my arm. "We have to go back." But when I turned around, the trail behind us was no longer there. Instead, there was a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. The 6 people across the bridge began backing away. The woman screamed, "Don't let him make you look at him!" Something beneath the bridge laughed. Then a hand slowly wrapped around one of the wooden beams. It was human, pale, long fingers. Then another hand appeared, and another. Caleb whispered, "That's not the thing I saw." I asked him what he meant. He stared beneath the bridge and said, "There were only 2 hands last time." A face slowly rose from beneath the bridge. It was mine. Same eyes, same scar, same ranger uniform. It looked directly at me and smiled. Then it whispered, "You finally found him?" Caleb started screaming. I raised my flashlight toward the thing's face. For 1 second, the beam illuminated it clearly. Its mouth was packed with photographs. Dozens of tiny photographs shoved between its teeth. Every photograph showed someone standing in the woods. And the final photograph, hanging from its mouth, showed me and Caleb standing on that bridge. But in the picture, there was someone else standing behind us, someone we couldn't see in real life. The thing beneath the bridge slowly pulled itself upward. Then it whispered one sentence that made Caleb drop to his knees. "He isn't missing anymore." I looked at Caleb. "Who isn't?" He pointed at me. "You." For several seconds, neither of us moved. Caleb was staring at me as if I had suddenly become something he didn't recognize, and the thing beneath the bridge had completely disappeared. I slowly lowered my flashlight and told him to stay calm. But he backed away from me. "Don't come closer," he whispered. I asked him why, and he pointed at my chest. My ranger badge was missing. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. The badge had been pinned there when I entered the forest that morning, but now there was only a small hole in my shirt. Caleb whispered, "He took it." I told him that wasn't possible, but then something metallic fell from the trees behind us. My badge landed in the mud. It was covered in blood. I reached for it, but Caleb screamed, "Don't touch it!" We ran. We crossed the bridge as quickly as possible, ignoring the 6 missing people who were still standing on the opposite side. When I looked back, they were gone. The bridge was empty. No people, no footprints, nothing. Caleb kept running until we reached a clearing surrounded by enormous trees. In the center was the cabin he had described. It looked abandoned from the outside, but smoke was rising from the chimney. I asked Caleb if this was the place he had seen. He nodded. "That's where he keeps the pictures." I wanted to leave, but we had no idea where the trail was anymore. The only way forward was through the cabin. I opened the door. The smell hit me first. Wet wood, mold, and something metallic. The walls were covered in photographs. hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Some were pinned directly into the wood. Others hung from strings across the ceiling. Every photograph showed people inside the Appalachian forest: hikers, hunters, rangers, children, families. Some photographs were decades old. Others looked brand new. Caleb walked toward one wall and froze. "That's my mother." He pointed to a photograph of a woman standing beside a campsite. She was smiling at the camera. Caleb's mother had died when he was 12. He reached toward the photograph. I grabbed his wrist. "Don't touch anything." Then I noticed the date written beneath it: August 8th, 2026. Today's date. Caleb stared at me. "That's impossible." We moved farther inside. On another wall were photographs of missing hikers. I recognized every face from old search files, but there was something wrong with the photographs. Every missing person appeared in 2 pictures. The first showed them before they disappeared. The second showed them standing inside this cabin. Some looked frightened. Some looked directly at the camera. Some were smiling. Then I saw a photograph of myself. I was standing beside the cabin door. The date beneath it was tomorrow. Caleb saw it too. "You're going to disappear tomorrow." I didn't answer. I looked for another photograph. There was one. It showed me standing inside the cabin, but this time, my face was turned toward the camera. My eyes were black. My mouth was open. Something was standing behind me. I couldn't see its face, but one hand rested on my shoulder. Caleb whispered, "That's him." Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut behind us. We both jumped. The photographs on the walls began moving. Not physically, but the people inside them were changing positions, heads turning, eyes shifting. Some figures were now looking directly at us. Then every photograph went completely black. A voice came from upstairs. "Caleb!" He froze. The voice sounded like his mother. "Caleb, sweetheart, come upstairs." He started walking toward the staircase. I grabbed him. "That's not your mother." He began crying. "I know." The voice called again. "Caleb, I'm waiting." Then another voice joined it. Mine. "Caleb, don't listen to her." Caleb looked at me. "You didn't say that." I hadn't. The voice came again from upstairs, now sounding exactly like me. "Caleb, don't listen to him." We stood completely still. Then footsteps began descending the staircase. One step. Pause. Another. Pause. Then the figure appeared. It was me, wearing my ranger uniform. But unlike the copy from beneath the bridge, this one looked exactly normal. Same face, same voice, same everything. It smiled and said, "You're making this much harder than it needs to be." Caleb whispered, "Which one is real?" The copy looked at him. "Neither of you." I raised my weapon. The copy laughed. "You still think that matters?" It stepped closer. "Do you know why the park keeps sending rangers here?" I said nothing. It continued. "Because someone has to bring the missing people home." I asked where the missing people were. It pointed toward the photographs. "They're right here." Then the photographs began whispering. Hundreds of voices, names, dates, pleas for help. Some were screaming. Some were laughing. One voice kept repeating my name. The copy leaned toward me. "You were supposed to bring Caleb back." I asked what would happen if I didn't. It smiled. "Then someone else will wear your face." Caleb suddenly grabbed a lantern from the table and threw it against the wall. Flames erupted across the photographs. The copy screamed. Every picture began burning at once. The cabin filled with smoke. We ran through the back door and into the forest. Behind us, Something screamed so loudly that birds exploded from the trees. We didn't stop until we reached a gravel road. A Park Service truck was parked there. I ran toward it, waving my arms. The driver was another ranger. He jumped out and shouted, "Are you okay?" I told him we needed help. He looked at Caleb and then at me. His expression changed. "Where's the other one?" I said. "What other one?" He pointed behind us. "The ranger who came out of the woods before you." My blood went cold. There was nobody else. He shook his head. "He looked exactly like you." Caleb started crying. The ranger told us to get inside the truck. We drove toward the nearest station. For the first 10 minutes, nobody spoke. Then the ranger looked at me through the mirror. "What's your name?" I told him. "Evan Hale." He nodded slowly. Then he asked Caleb, "And what's his name?" Caleb looked at me. His face went completely pale. He whispered, "I don't know." I stared at him. "Caleb, you know me." He shook his head. "I don't." The ranger slammed on the brakes. The truck stopped in the middle of the road. I looked down at my hands. I suddenly couldn't remember when I had joined the Park Service. I couldn't remember my home address. I couldn't remember my family. I couldn't even remember my own face. The ranger pulled his weapon and aimed it at me. "Get out." I stepped out of the truck. Caleb remained inside. I looked through the passenger window. He was crying. I asked him why he didn't know me. He whispered, "Because the real Ranger Hale disappeared 4 days ago." The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned toward the road. There was a photograph lying in the gravel. I picked it up. It showed Caleb standing beside the trail. Beside him was Ranger Evan Hale, the real Evan Hale, and behind both of them was me. I turned the photograph over. Written on the back were 6 words. "He doesn't know he's the copy." I dropped it. The ranger inside the truck shouted something, but I couldn't hear him anymore. The forest had become completely silent. Then my radio crackled. A voice whispered my name. "Evan!" I looked toward the trees. Someone stepped out. It was the real me. Same face, same uniform, same badge. He looked terrified. He raised both hands and shouted, "Don't let them take you!" I backed away. Then the ranger inside the truck screamed. Caleb screamed too. I turned around. The truck was empty. No ranger. No Caleb. The doors were wide open. Their footprints led into the forest. I was alone. My radio crackled again. This time the voice wasn't mine. It was Caleb's. "Evan, we're at the cabin." I asked where. He whispered, "Where you left us." Then another voice came through. The voice of the thing beneath the bridge. "He thinks he's the ranger now." I looked down at the photograph still lying in the road. The image had changed. There were now 3 people standing in it. Caleb, the real Evan Hale, and me. But a 4th figure had appeared behind us. It was wearing the ranger's uniform. It had my face, and underneath the photograph, a new date had appeared. Tomorrow. I ran toward the road. I never made it. Search teams later found my ranger truck abandoned near the trail. They found no blood, no footprints, and no sign of a struggle. They did find one photograph sitting on the driver's seat. It showed the search team standing around my empty truck. On the back, someone had written, "They're looking for Ranger Hale." Beneath that was another sentence. They just haven't realized yet that there are 2 of him. The strangest part came afterward. The search commander reviewed the body camera footage from the recovery operation. At 3:14 in the afternoon, the camera captured something standing deep between the trees. A ranger watching them. The commander zoomed in. It was me. Then, At exactly 3:15, another ranger appeared beside me. Then another. Then another. By the end of the recording, there were 19 rangers standing silently in the forest. Every one of them had the same face. Mine. The footage was classified. But someone forgot to remove one final frame. In that frame, one of the figures is holding a photograph toward the camera. The photograph shows the person watching the footage, and beneath his picture are 3 words. You're next, Ranger. Story 4. The emergency beacon was transmitting from inside my ranger station, even though the station was empty when I arrived. It was 11:48 p.m. during a freezing January night in the Appalachian Mountains, and I had just finished checking a remote section of trail when my radio suddenly chirped with an automated distress signal. The coordinates appeared on my handheld GPS, and for several seconds I simply stared at them, because they pointed to Ranger Station 14, the same station I was standing inside. I looked around the room. Empty desk, cold fireplace, 2 chairs, old maps covering the walls. Nothing unusual. I checked the beacon frequency again. The signal was definitely coming from inside the building. I walked through every room, opening closets and storage cabinets, until the signal became strongest near an old basement door that hadn't been used in years. The door was locked with a heavy steel chain. I radioed dispatch and told them I was receiving an emergency beacon from beneath the station. The dispatcher went silent. Then she asked me to repeat the location. I did. Her voice became nervous. Ranger Cole, there is no basement beneath Station 14. I looked at the floor. I'm standing beside a basement door, she replied. There is no basement. Before I could answer, something knocked from the other side of the door. 3 times. Slow. Deliberate. I stepped backward. The radio crackled. A man's voice whispered, "Don't open it." I asked who was speaking. The voice replied, "You already know." I recognized it immediately. It was my own voice. I turned off the radio. Another 3 knocks came from the basement door. I decided to leave the station and call for another ranger, but when I opened the front door, I wasn't looking at the snowy forest anymore. I was looking at the same hallway. I closed the door and opened it again. Hallway. I tried the side exit. Hallway. Back door. Hallway. Every exit led back inside the station. I called dispatch on my cell phone. No signal. Then the emergency beacon began beeping faster. The coordinates on my GPS changed. Instead of showing Station 14, they now showed a point approximately 200 feet beneath the ground. I stared at the screen until the numbers changed again. They now showed my exact location. I heard something moving beneath the floorboards. Slow footsteps. 1 step. Pause. Another step. Then something dragged across the wood underneath me. I grabbed my flashlight and searched the station for another way out. Behind a filing cabinet, I found an old maintenance hatch. I pulled it open and discovered a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The stairs looked ancient, made from rough stone, completely unlike the wooden station above. I radioed dispatch one final time. "I'm going below the station," Static answered. Then a woman's voice whispered, "There is no below." I started down anyway. The air became colder with every step. After 20 stairs, I reached a stone corridor. Old lanterns were mounted along the walls, and somehow every one of them was burning. I walked forward and found a door. Someone had carved a ranger badge into the wood. Beneath it were dozens of names. I recognized some from old park records, rangers who had disappeared over the past 50 years. The final name was mine. I stepped away from the door. Something scratched from the other side. Then a voice whispered, "Cole." I didn't answer. Cole, open the door. It sounded like my supervisor. I knew he wasn't there. Then the voice changed. It became my father's voice, then my mother's, then my own. "Please." I kept walking. The corridor opened into a huge underground chamber. In the center was an old wooden table covered with ranger equipment. Radios, flashlights, maps, badges, personal belongings. Every item had a name attached to it. I saw a watch belonging to a ranger who disappeared in 1989. A photograph of another ranger who vanished in 1997. A wedding ring from someone missing since 2004. Then I saw my own flashlight sitting on the table, the one currently in my hand. I checked mine. It was still there. I slowly looked back at the table. The second flashlight turned on by itself. Its beam pointed directly at a dark corner. Something was standing there. I raised my weapon. "Park Ranger!" The figure stepped into the light. It was an old man wearing a ranger uniform from another era. His face was badly scarred. He looked at me and whispered, "You shouldn't have followed the signal." I asked who he was. He said, "I'm the last one." I asked him what this place was. He looked around the chamber. "This is where the mountain keeps us." I thought he meant the missing rangers were trapped underground, but then he pointed toward the ceiling. "We're not under the station." I looked up. Above us was a night sky, stars, clouds, a full moon. We were standing inside an enormous underground cavern, yet the ceiling looked like an open sky. The old ranger whispered, "The mountain doesn't have a bottom." Something moved across the stars. Huge, slow, too far away to identify. I asked him how to escape. He said, "You don't." Then my radio turned on. Dispatch was calling me. "Ranger Cole, respond." I grabbed it. "I'm here." The dispatcher sounded relieved. "Thank God. We've been trying to reach you for 3 hours." I looked at my watch. It had been less than 30 minutes. "Where are you?" she asked. I told her I was beneath Station 14. Silence. Then she whispered, "Cole, Station 14 burned down in 1976. The old ranger closed his eyes. I asked dispatch what she could see. She said, "We're standing at the ruins right now." I looked around the chamber. The old ranger was gone. The table was gone, the lanterns were gone. I was standing alone in darkness. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned my flashlight around. The old ranger was standing there again. But now there were dozens of him, all wearing different uniforms, all staring at me. One stepped forward. "You heard the signal?" I asked what signal. He pointed toward the darkness behind me. I turned. A red emergency beacon was blinking on the ground. It was the exact beacon from my ranger truck, the one I had never carried inside. It flashed 3 times. Then the entire chamber began to shake. The rangers around me started whispering in unison. Someone answered. I looked at the beacon. A small screen displayed a message. "Search party inbound." Then another message appeared beneath it. "Arrival, 11:48 p.m. I looked at my watch. It was 11:47. The old ranger smiled. "They're coming." I asked who. He pointed toward the darkness. "The ones who sent the signal." Somewhere far below us, I heard a vehicle engine start. Then headlights appeared through the trees that shouldn't have been there. A ranger truck slowly emerged from the darkness. Its driver's door opened. Someone stepped out. He was wearing my uniform. He looked directly at me. Then he raised his radio and said, in my exact voice, "Ranger Cole, we've come to take you home." The old ranger leaned close to my ear and whispered one final thing. "Don't go with him." Then the lights went out. The darkness lasted only a few seconds, but when the lights returned, the ranger truck was gone. So were the headlights, the old rangers, and the stone chamber. I was standing in the middle of a snow-covered trail, beneath a sky filled with stars, and for one brief moment, I thought I had somehow escaped. Then I noticed the snow around my boots. There were dozens of footprints surrounding me, but every single print was mine. Same tread pattern, same damaged heel. They formed a perfect circle around the place where I was standing, as if hundreds of versions of me had been waiting there. I radioed dispatch. "This is Ranger Cole. I need immediate assistance." Static answered. Then my own voice came through. "Assistance is already there." I looked toward the trees. A flashlight was moving between them. Someone was approaching. I raised my weapon and shouted, "Identify yourself." The flashlight stopped. A voice answered, "Ranger Cole." I recognized it. It was the old ranger from the underground chamber. I followed the light, but when I reached the trees, there was nobody there. Instead, I found another ranger station. It looked exactly like Station 14, but the building was new, clean, and brightly lit. The front door was open. I entered cautiously. Inside, everything looked normal. A radio was sitting on the desk. A map hung on the wall. A wood stove was burning, and someone was sitting in the chair with his back toward me. "Sir," the man slowly turned. It was me, not a copy that looked like me. Me, exactly as I remembered myself. He stood up and said, "You're finally here." I asked him what this place was. He pointed toward the map. "Station 14. I told him Station 14 had burned down decades ago. He smiled. "That's what they tell everyone." Then he showed me the map. Every trail in the park was marked with a red line. But the lines weren't normal trails. They formed a giant circle around the mountain. At the center was one black dot. He pointed to it. "That's where the signal comes from." I asked what was there. He looked at me and said, "You." I stepped backward. He continued, "Every ranger who receives the emergency beacon eventually comes here. The mountain copies them, sends the copy back, and waits for another ranger to answer the signal." I asked how long this had been happening. He pointed toward a shelf. Hundreds of ranger badges were arranged there. Some were ancient. Some looked new. My badge was sitting at the end. I looked down at my chest. My badge was still there. I touched it. The copy smiled. "That one won't be yours for much longer." Suddenly the radio crackled. Dispatch's voice came through. "Ranger Cole, we have located your vehicle." I grabbed the radio. "Where?" she replied. "At Station 14. I said. "I'm at Station 14. Silence. Then she whispered, "No, you're not." I looked around. The room began changing. The walls became older. The paint peeled away. The stove went cold. The windows disappeared. Within seconds, I was standing inside the burned remains of the original station. Charred beams surrounded me. Snow was falling through the collapsed roof. The copy was gone. On the floor was an old ranger notebook. I opened it. The first page was dated 1976. The final page was dated that same night. My name was written at the top. I read the final entry. "Tonight the mountain will call another ranger. He will believe the station is still standing. He will meet himself. He will be told not to follow the truck. He will follow anyway." I stopped reading. Outside the ruined station, headlights appeared. A ranger truck was approaching through the snow. I recognized it immediately. It was my truck. The driver's door opened. I stepped out of the ruins and saw myself standing beside the vehicle. He looked exactly like me. He smiled and shouted, "Cole, get in!" I remembered the old ranger's warning. Don't go with him. I stayed where I was. The copy's smile disappeared. You don't understand, he said. If you stay here, they will come. I asked who. He looked behind me. The mountain. The ground began vibrating. Snow slid from the trees. Somewhere beneath my feet, something enormous moved. The copy got into the truck and started the engine. Last chance. I refused. He drove away into the forest. The moment the truck disappeared, every radio frequency around me came alive. Hundreds of voices spoke simultaneously. Rangers, hikers, children, missing people, all saying the same sentence. We found you. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I slowly turned. The old ranger stood in the snow. He was covered in ash. You didn't take the truck, he said. I shook my head. He looked relieved. Good. Then he pointed toward the road. Now run. I asked why. He said, because that's not the thing you should be afraid of. I looked toward the trees. The ranger truck had returned. It was parked about 50 yards away. The engine was off. The driver's door was open. I could see someone sitting inside. I raised my flashlight. The beam reached the driver's seat. It was empty. Then something moved in the back. A hand slowly pressed against the rear window from inside. Another hand appeared beside it. Then another. Dozens of hands covered the glass. The old ranger whispered, "They've been waiting for you." The truck suddenly started moving without a driver. It rolled toward us slowly. I stepped backward. The old ranger grabbed my shoulder. "Don't let it touch you." The truck accelerated. I ran. We disappeared into the trees as the vehicle crashed into the ruined station. The impact shook the mountain. Flames erupted. Inside the burning truck, dozens of voices screamed at once. Then one voice rose above the others. Mine. "Cole, help me!" I stopped. The old ranger grabbed my arm. "That's how it gets you." I kept running. We reached a narrow ridge overlooking the valley. Below us, hundreds of lights were moving through the forest. Search teams, rangers, vehicles. I could hear them calling my name. "Ranger Cole!" "Cole, where are you?" "We found your truck." The old ranger stared down at them. "They're not search teams." I asked what they were. He whispered, "They're the people who answered before you." Then he disappeared. I was alone again. I walked toward the lights because I had nowhere else to go. When I reached the first group, I recognized every face. Rangers who had disappeared over the past 50 years. They stood silently around my truck. The copy of me was there too. He looked at me and smiled. "You finally understand." I asked what he wanted. He said, "Nothing." Then he pointed toward the truck. "It wants you." The driver's door opened by itself. Inside was a radio. The radio crackled. "Ranger Cole, respond." I didn't answer. "Ranger Cole, respond." I still didn't answer. Then the voice changed into that of my supervisor. "Cole, your shift is over." I almost laughed. It sounded so normal, so familiar. Then the radio whispered, "Come home." I stepped toward the vehicle. The old ranger's warning echoed in my head. "Don't go with him." I stopped. The copy of me suddenly looked terrified. "Don't," he whispered. "Whatever you hear next, don't look inside." The truck's interior light turned on. I looked anyway. There was no driver. There was no passenger. There was only a ranger uniform folded neatly across the back seat. My uniform. Beside it was a photograph. I picked it up. It showed Station 14 burning in 1976. Dozens of rangers stood outside watching the fire. At the edge of the photograph was a young ranger. I recognized him. It was the old ranger. But beside him was another person. Me. I turned the photograph over. Written on the back were the words, "The first ranger who answered the signal was Evan Cole." I dropped the photograph. My entire body went cold. The old ranger wasn't the first ranger to disappear. He'd been waiting for me for 50 years. The copy stepped closer. "Now you know why the mountain remembers your name." I asked him what my name had to do with it. He whispered, "Because you're not the ranger who answered the signal." He pointed at the forest behind me. "You're the signal." Suddenly, every radio in the valley turned on. My voice came through all of them at once. "Emergency! Ranger down! Send help!" The copy began crying. "No!" The voices repeated louder. "Emergency! Ranger down! Send help!" Then I heard a distant response. A real dispatcher, a real ranger station. Someone had received the call. The copy looked at me with pure terror. "They're coming." I asked who. He whispered, "The next ranger." Then the forest went completely silent. Hours later, a search team found an abandoned ranger truck near the mountain. There was no sign of me, no footprints, no blood, no equipment. Only one thing was left inside the vehicle, a working emergency beacon. It was transmitting from beneath the ground. The coordinates led directly to the ruins of Station 14. The search commander turned off the beacon. 3 seconds later, it turned itself back on. Then his radio crackled. A frightened voice whispered, "Please, send a ranger." The commander asked who was calling. The voice answered with my name. "Evan Cole." The commander looked at the team around him and said, "Cole's been missing for 3 days." Nobody spoke. Then the beacon displayed a new message, "Arrival confirmed." And beneath it, in smaller letters, another message appeared. "Ranger Cole has returned." The commander stared at the screen. "Where?" The radio answered. "He's standing behind you." Every member of the search team turned around at once. There was nobody there. But one of their body cameras recorded something they didn't notice until later. At the exact moment everyone turned, a figure appeared between the trees, wearing a ranger uniform, watching them. And when the video was enhanced, the figure wasn't looking at the search team. It was looking directly into the camera. It was smiling. Then it raised one finger to its lips and whispered, "Don't tell them where I am." Story 5. The dog wasn't barking at the bear. It was barking at the empty house. I realized that at 1:13 in the morning, while standing beside an abandoned trailhead deep in the Appalachian backcountry, listening to a K9 named Boone growl at a farmhouse that had been empty for almost 20 years. I was the ranger assigned to the night patrol, and my partner, Deputy Mason, kept insisting there was probably a raccoon inside, but Boone wouldn't move. The dog's hair was raised along his spine, his teeth were showing, and every few seconds he made a low sound I had never heard from him before. The house stood at the end of an overgrown road, surrounded by dead apple trees and a collapsed wooden fence. According to the park records, the family who lived there had abandoned it in 2006 after the father disappeared. The mother and 2 children supposedly moved out of state. No one had lived there since. We had received a strange call from a hiker earlier that night, claiming he had seen someone standing in one of the upstairs windows. We assumed it was trespassing, so Mason and I went to check it out. I called out, "Park Ranger!" Nothing. Boone suddenly lunged toward the porch. Mason grabbed his leash. "Easy, boy!" Boone refused to move backward. Then the upstairs window lit up. A yellow light appeared behind the curtains. Mason looked at me. "You said there's no power here." I nodded. "There isn't." The light disappeared. Then it appeared in another window. Then another. One by one, every window on the second floor illuminated. Boone began whining. We approached the front door. It was already open. Inside, the house smelled like wet wood and something rotten. Dust covered the furniture, but there were fresh footprints across the floor. Small, bare footprints. They started at the front door and led toward the staircase. Mason drew his weapon. Someone's been staying here. I nodded and followed the footprints. Boone refused to enter. I called him, but he backed away and stared into the darkness beneath the stairs. I asked Mason to check the area while I went upstairs. The footprints continued along the hallway and stopped outside a child's bedroom. The door was slightly open. I pushed it with my flashlight. Inside was an old wooden bed, a broken rocking horse, and a row of children's drawings pinned to the wall. Every drawing showed the same thing: a house surrounded by trees, a family standing outside, and a tall black figure watching from the forest. The final drawing was different. It showed a park ranger standing beside the house. The ranger had my uniform. Underneath the drawing, written in childish handwriting, were the words, "He comes when the dog stops barking." I heard Boone barking downstairs. Then, suddenly he stopped. Complete silence. I ran back toward the stairs. "Boone?" No answer. Mason shouted from below, "Ranger!" I rushed downstairs. Mason was standing beside the front door. Boone was gone. His leash was still attached to Mason's belt, but the dog was no longer there. The leash extended across the floor and disappeared beneath the stairs. Mason pulled it. Something pulled back. We both froze. He slowly released the leash. It disappeared into the darkness beneath the stairs. Then Boone barked once from somewhere inside the wall. Mason whispered, "That's impossible." We searched the house but found no dog. Then we heard a child's voice from upstairs. "He found him." I raised my flashlight. Mason whispered, "We're leaving." We stepped outside. The moment we crossed the porch, the front door slammed shut. Boone's barking started again, but now it was coming from inside the house. We called for backup. Dispatch answered immediately. "What's your location?" I gave the coordinates. Silence. Then dispatch asked, "Are you sure?" I repeated the location. She said, "There hasn't been a farmhouse there since 1989. Mason looked at me. "What?" Dispatch continued. "That entire area was flooded when the old reservoir was created. The road you're describing doesn't exist." I looked behind us. The farmhouse was still standing. The road was still there. The dead apple trees were still swaying in the wind. I told dispatch we could see the building. She said, "Ranger, listen to me. Do not enter that house again." Then the radio cut out. Mason and I started walking toward the vehicle. We had gone maybe 50 yards when we heard footsteps behind us. Slow. Bare feet on wet dirt. I turned around. A little girl was standing on the porch. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She wore an old-fashioned white dress and held something in her hands. I shouted, "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. She simply pointed at Boone. The dog was standing beside her, but Boone wasn't looking at us. He was staring into the upstairs window. I looked up. A man was standing behind the glass. He was tall and impossibly thin. His face was hidden in darkness. The little girl whispered something. I couldn't hear her. I stepped closer. She repeated it. "He's not in the house." I asked, "Who?" She pointed toward the forest behind us. "He's behind you." Mason and I turned simultaneously. Nothing. When we looked back at the porch, the girl was gone. Boone was gone too. The front door of the farmhouse was open again. Then something inside the house began knocking against the wall. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. Pause. 3 times. Mason whispered, We're done. We ran toward the truck. The engine started immediately. We drove nearly a mile before Boone suddenly appeared in the back seat. I nearly lost control of the vehicle. He was sitting perfectly still, staring through the rear window. Mason turned around and shouted his name. Boone didn't react. I looked into the mirror. Something was sitting beside him. A little girl. She was staring directly at me. I slammed the brakes. The back seat was empty. Boone was gone again. We searched the truck. Nothing. Then I noticed something scratched into the inside of the rear window. 4 words. You left him behind. Mason asked who him meant. I didn't know. Then my radio came alive. A child's voice whispered, "The ranger." I asked, "Which ranger?" The voice answered, "The one who is still in the house." I looked toward the farmhouse. It was no longer there. Only the forest remained. But deep between the trees, I could see a yellow light glowing from an upstairs window. Mason stared at it. "There's no house." I nodded. The radio crackled again. This time, the voice was mine. "Mason, don't look at the window." He slowly turned toward me. "You just said that." I shook my head. "No, I didn't." My own voice came through the radio again. "Mason, don't look at the window." Then the voice whispered, "He's looking at you." Mason froze. His eyes widened. He was staring at something behind my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I asked him what he saw. He whispered, "Your dog." I said, "Boone isn't my dog." Mason's face went pale. "I know." Then Boone barked from directly behind me. 1 bark, 2, 3. And a child's voice whispered into my ear, "Now, the house knows your name." I didn't turn around when Boone barked behind me. I couldn't. Every instinct I had was telling me that whatever was standing there wanted me to look at it. And after years of working alone in the mountains, I had learned that some things become dangerous the moment you acknowledge them. Mason was still frozen beside the truck, staring over my shoulder. I whispered, "Don't move." He nodded. Then the voice behind me spoke again. It was a child's voice, soft and almost playful. "Ranger." I kept my eyes forward. "What?" Mason whispered. "You answered it." I realized he was right. The voice behind me laughed. Then Boone barked again. But this time, the sound came from somewhere far away in the forest. Mason grabbed my arm. "We need to leave." We climbed into the truck and drove without looking back. The road was narrow, wet, and surrounded by trees so thick that our headlights barely reached 10 feet ahead. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Mason said, "Something is wrong with the GPS." I looked down. The map showed us driving directly through a lake. I checked the road ahead. It was still there. Mason refreshed the screen. The map changed. Now it showed the farmhouse directly behind us. We hadn't passed it. I looked into the rearview mirror. Nothing. Just darkness. Then the radio crackled. Dispatch finally came back. "Unit 17, respond." Mason answered immediately. "Go ahead." The dispatcher asked, "Are you still at the old Reservoir Road?" Mason said no. There was a long pause. "Mason, there is no Reservoir Road." He looked at me. I took the radio. "Dispatch, we found a missing K9. The dispatcher asked, "What K9? I said, "Boone." Another silence. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. "Boone died 3 years ago." Mason stared at me. "What?" The dispatcher continued. "The K9 named Boone was retired after an incident in 2023. He was put down after developing severe neurological problems." I looked toward the back seat. It was empty. Mason whispered, "Then what was in the truck?" The radio crackled. The dispatcher suddenly shouted, "Get out of the vehicle!" I asked why. She screamed. "Because your vehicle is not moving." I looked at the speedometer. We were doing 50 miles per hour. Then I looked through the windshield. The road ahead had disappeared. We were driving directly toward the farmhouse. It stood in the middle of the forest, every upstairs window glowing yellow. Mason grabbed the steering wheel. "Brake!" I slammed my foot down. Nothing happened. The truck kept moving. We passed through the front door without slowing down. There was no impact. 1 second we were on the road, the next we were inside the farmhouse. The engine died. The headlights remained on, illuminating the empty living room. Mason looked at me. "We're not getting out through the door." I tried the driver's door. It wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't move. The radio was dead. Then we heard a child laughing upstairs. Mason drew his weapon. "Stay behind me." We climbed out through the rear hatch and entered the house. The floorboards creaked beneath our boots. The furniture was covered in dust, but fresh footprints crossed the floor. Small, bare footprints. They led toward the stairs. I recognized them immediately. They were the same prints we'd seen earlier, but now there were 2 sets. One belonged to a child. The other was the tread pattern from my ranger boots. Mason looked down at my feet. "You haven't walked upstairs yet." I stared at the footprints. He was right. My boots had never touched that floor. We followed the prints anyway. At the top of the stairs, we found the child's bedroom. The door was open. The drawings were still pinned to the wall. But there was a new drawing. It showed 2 rangers standing outside the house. One was Mason. The other was me. Above us was a black figure. Beneath the drawing, the child had written, "One of them is already inside." Mason whispered, "Which one?" I didn't answer. Then we heard breathing from inside the closet. Mason pointed his weapon toward it. "Come out." No response. He opened the closet door. Empty. But written across the back wall were dozens of names. Some were park rangers, some were hikers, some were children. The newest name was Mason's. Beneath it was mine, and beneath mine was a blank line. I asked Mason what that meant. He whispered, "I think it means there's still room for someone else." Something knocked on the bedroom window. We both turned. The little girl was standing outside on the 2nd floor. She was smiling. There was no ground beneath her. She was simply standing against the glass. She raised one finger and pointed behind us. Mason and I turned slowly. A man was standing in the doorway. Tall, thin. His face was completely hidden. He wore an old ranger uniform. I recognized the badge. It belonged to the ranger who disappeared from this area in 1989. The man whispered, "You left him behind." I asked who. He pointed at Mason. Then Mason's radio turned on by itself. A recording began playing. It was Mason's voice. "If anything happens to me, don't trust Evan." Mason stared at me. "I never said that." The recording continued. "He's not the ranger who came into the house." I raised my weapon toward Mason. He immediately raised his hands. "Don't!" I asked him where he had been when Boone disappeared. He said he had been beside me. I asked him why he couldn't remember leaving the truck. He didn't answer. Then the little girl outside the window whispered, "Because he never did." Mason's face changed. His eyes became completely blank. He looked at me and smiled. "You should have listened to the dog." I stepped backward. "Mason?" He tilted his head. "Boone tried to warn you." I raised my weapon. He lunged. We crashed into the wall. His strength was impossible. I hit him with my flashlight and he fell. For 1 second, he looked normal again. Terrified. "Evan," he whispered. "Run." Then his face changed. His jaw stretched downward. His mouth opened far wider than a human mouth should. I ran. I don't remember reaching the stairs. I only remember hearing Mason screaming behind me, followed by dozens of voices screaming with him. I burst through the front door and found myself standing outside in the forest. The farmhouse was gone. My truck was gone. The road was gone. I was alone beneath a moonless sky. My radio suddenly crackled. Dispatch spoke. "Ranger Hale, do you copy?" I answered. "Yes," she said. "We've been trying to reach you for 6 hours." I looked at my watch. It was 1:13 a.m., exactly the same time the incident had started. I asked her where I was. She gave me coordinates. I checked my GPS. The coordinates pointed to the abandoned farmhouse. I told her the house wasn't there. She replied, "There has never been a farmhouse there." Then I heard another voice on the radio. Mason. "Evan, don't let them find me," I shouted. "Mason, where are you?" He whispered, "In the house." I asked which house. He answered, "The one behind you." I slowly turned. The farmhouse was standing there again. Every upstairs window was dark except one. In that window stood Mason. He pressed his hand against the glass. I could see tears running down his face. He mouthed something. I couldn't hear it. Then he pointed toward the forest. I looked behind me. Boone was standing there. The old K9. His fur was wet. His eyes were fixed on the farmhouse. He walked toward me slowly and stopped beside my leg. For the first time that night, I felt safe. Then Boone looked up at me and growled. Not at the house. At me. I looked down. My ranger uniform was covered in mud. My hands were covered in mud. And on my chest, beneath my badge, was a name I had never seen before. Mason. I ripped the badge off. Beneath it was another one. Boone. Then another. Hundreds of names were layered beneath each other, like someone had been replacing ranger identities for decades. Boone backed away from me. The farmhouse door opened. The little girl stood on the porch. She looked directly at me and whispered, "You're the one who stayed." I asked what she meant. She smiled. "The real Ranger Hale went home." My heart stopped. I asked, "When?" She pointed toward the road. 3 years ago." Then she disappeared. I stood there alone with Boone. My radio crackled one final time. A dispatcher said, "Ranger Hale, we've located your vehicle." I asked where. She answered, "At your house." I froze. "I'm not at home." The dispatcher became confused. "Yes, you are." Then I heard a door open on the radio. A woman's voice in the background said, "He's asleep." The dispatcher asked, "Who?" The woman answered, "Evan," I whispered. "Who is in my house?" The woman laughed softly. Then my own voice came through the radio. Calm. Awake. "Don't worry. I'm taking care of everything." The transmission ended. Boone began barking toward the forest. I looked in the direction he was staring. Far between the trees, another ranger was walking toward us. Same uniform, same face, same voice. He raised his hand and waved. Then another appeared behind him. Then another. Dozens of them emerged from the darkness, all wearing my face. And behind them stood Mason. He was smiling. The little girl was holding his hand. She looked at me and whispered, "Now, you understand why nobody finds the missing rangers." Then all the copies began walking toward me. My radio came alive one last time. My own voice whispered, "You were never searching for us." A pause. "We were searching for you." The last thing I heard before the transmission died was Boone barking once, followed by the sound of hundreds of bare feet running through the forest toward me. Story 6. The call came from a ranger who had been dead for 9 years, and he only said one thing: "Don't let them reach the fire tower. It was 2:41 in the morning when the emergency channel suddenly came alive inside our backcountry station, and because I was the only ranger on overnight duty, I picked up the radio expecting a routine medical call or a lost hiker. Instead, I heard a man's breathing, slow and exhausted, followed by 3 words that made me sit completely still. "Ranger, they're coming." I asked for his location. The voice gave me coordinates for an abandoned fire tower deep inside a section of Appalachian forest that had been closed after a ranger disappeared there in 2017. I checked the coordinates twice because the location was almost 12 miles from the nearest maintained trail. I asked the caller for his name. He didn't answer. I asked again. This time he whispered, "You already know." Then the transmission ended. I searched the ranger database and found the coordinates were associated with an old incident report involving Ranger Samuel Cross, who had disappeared during a storm in October 2017. His body was never recovered. I remember reading that report during training because the final radio transmission had been recorded. Cross had said, "They're coming up the mountain." Then there had been static, followed by a sound investigators couldn't identify. I grabbed my gear and headed out before I could talk myself out of it. The mountain was buried beneath fog that night, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. When I reached the old trailhead, I found the gate unlocked. That bothered me immediately, because the lock had been replaced only 2 weeks earlier. I entered the restricted trail and started climbing. 20 minutes in, I found the first sign that someone had been there recently. A cigarette butt lay in the mud, still warm. I radioed dispatch. No response. I tried again. Nothing. Then my radio crackled and a man's voice whispered, "Keep walking." I stopped. "Who is this?" Silence. Then the voice said, "If you turn around, they'll know you can see them." I didn't turn around. I kept walking. The trail became narrower until the trees pressed against both sides of me. About 40 minutes later, I saw a flashlight ahead. Someone was standing in the middle of the trail. I called out, "Park Ranger!" The figure didn't move. I approached carefully and recognized the uniform. Ranger Samuel Cross. He was standing with his back toward me. His uniform was exactly as it appeared in the old photographs, right down to the damaged shoulder patch. I called his name. He slowly turned his head but didn't turn his body. His face was pale and wet, and his eyes looked almost completely black. He whispered, "You came alone." I said yes. He shook his head. "You weren't supposed to." I asked him what had happened to him in 2017. He pointed toward the fire tower. "I didn't disappear." I asked what he meant. He said, "They took my name." Then he looked past me into the trees. His expression changed from calm to terror. "They're here." I turned around before remembering his warning. There was nothing behind me. When I faced him again, Cross was gone. His flashlight was lying in the mud. I picked it up. It was still warm. I continued toward the fire tower. The structure appeared through the fog about 30 minutes later. The old tower rose above the trees like a black skeleton, and a faint light was glowing inside the cabin at the top. I climbed the stairs. Halfway up, I heard footsteps above me. Slow footsteps. I called out, "Samuel!" A voice answered, "Don't come up." I stopped. "Why?" The voice replied, "Because I'm not alone." I continued climbing anyway. When I reached the cabin, the door was open. Inside were 6 people sitting around a wooden table. They were all wearing old ranger uniforms. I recognized 3 faces from missing person files. Rangers who had disappeared between 1978 and 2017. The other 3 were strangers. Every one of them was staring at me. An empty chair waited at the table. A ranger badge sat on it. My name was engraved across the metal. I asked, "Where is Samuel Cross?" An elderly ranger sitting at the end of the table looked at me. "He went downstairs." I asked what was downstairs. The man smiled. You? I didn't understand. Then one of the younger rangers pointed toward the window. Look! I approached the glass. Below the tower, hundreds of people were standing among the trees. Hikers, rangers, hunters, children, all completely motionless. Every face was turned toward the tower. The elderly ranger whispered, "They've been waiting for you." I asked who they were. He said, "Everyone who answered the call." I looked at the 6 people around the table. "Why are you here?" The elderly ranger replied, "Because someone has to answer when the tower calls." Then the radio on the table turned on. My own voice came through it. "Ranger, they're coming." I stared at the radio. The elderly ranger closed his eyes. "It's begun." The footsteps started on the stairs below us. One step, pause, another, then another. Everyone at the table became completely silent. The elderly ranger leaned toward me. "Whatever happens, don't let it touch your face." I asked why. He whispered, "That's how it learns you." The footsteps reached the cabin door. The handle slowly turned. The door opened. Samuel Cross stood there. But he looked different now. His face was normal. His uniform was clean. His eyes looked human. He smiled at me. "Good evening, Ranger." I asked him where he'd been. He said, "Downstairs." I looked at the other rangers. They were terrified. Samuel walked toward me. "You shouldn't have come." I asked what was happening. He stopped inches away from me. "The mountain has been without a ranger for 9 years." I said, "What does that mean?" He smiled. "It means it needs one." Suddenly, the windows shattered. The figures below began climbing the tower. Hundreds of hands grabbed the metal stairs. The rangers at the table began screaming. Samuel grabbed my shoulder. "Run!" We rushed through the back of the cabin and onto a narrow maintenance platform. I looked down. The stairs were covered with people climbing toward us. Their faces were wrong. Some had no eyes. Some had mouths stretched impossibly wide. Some wore ranger uniforms from decades ago. Samuel pulled me toward a ladder leading to the roof. We climbed. The wind was freezing. Below us, the entire mountain seemed alive. Thousands of tiny lights were moving between the trees. Samuel looked at me and whispered. When I disappeared, I thought they wanted my body. I asked what they wanted instead. He said, "My memory." And he pointed at my head. "That's what they came for." I heard a voice behind me. My mother's voice. "Come home." I froze. Samuel shouted, "Don't listen." Then I heard my father's voice. "You don't belong here." Then my own voice. "Turn around." I didn't. Samuel grabbed my face and forced me to look at him. "Whatever you hear, look at me." His eyes suddenly filled with tears. I made the mistake of looking. I asked what he saw. He whispered, "Myself." Then his face began changing. His skin stretched. His jaw shifted. His eyes became black. I screamed and shoved him away. He fell from the roof. I looked down. He was standing on the platform below, completely unharmed. Then another Samuel appeared beside him. Then another. Then dozens. Every one of them looked up at me. One raised a hand. "Ranger!" I climbed down the opposite side and ran into the forest. I didn't know where I was going. I just ran. The fog was so thick that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. After several minutes, I found a small cabin. I burst inside and locked the door. There was an old radio on the table. I turned it on. Dispatch answered immediately. "Ranger Mercer, where are you?" I told her I was near the fire tower. She said, "There is no fire tower in that section." I told her what I'd seen. She went silent. Then she said, "Ranger, we've been listening to your radio for 3 hours. I looked at my watch. It had only been 40 minutes. She continued. "The transmission has been repeating." I asked what it said. She replied, "It's your voice saying, 'Don't send anyone.'" I stared at the radio. My own voice came through. "Don't send anyone." I whispered, "That's not me." Dispatch said, "We know." Then she asked, "Ranger, what's behind you?" I slowly turned. A wall. Nothing else. I looked back at the radio. The dispatcher whispered, "Not in the room. Behind you on the transmission." I listened carefully. Beneath my breathing, there was another sound. Footsteps. Someone was walking directly behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Then a voice whispered from the radio, "He's standing closer now." I threw the radio across the room. The cabin lights went out. In the darkness, someone knocked on the door. 3 times. Then Samuel Cross spoke from outside. "Ranger, open the door." I stayed silent. "Please." His voice sounded terrified. "It's me." Then another Samuel spoke from behind the cabin. "Don't open it." Then another from the roof. "He's lying." Then another from beneath the floor. "They're all lying." The cabin began shaking. I grabbed my flashlight and found a trapdoor beneath the table. I opened it and climbed down. A narrow tunnel led into darkness. I followed it until I reached another chamber. In the center was a wooden chair.